Ophidia is a well-known rabble-rouser, right? He's not a well rabble-rouser or just a known rabble-rouser. He's a well-known rabble-rouser. When you hyphenate, right? Yeah, so when you hyphenate it, you get a meaning. But you still don't know why I started talking about hyphens, right? Fair enough. We often use hyphens to describe the complexity of a person's identity. Terms like Jamaican American or Ghanaian American are sometimes hyphenated. It's been a long time that people have used hyphens as a way to describe complex identities. Now, for a long time, African American and Mexican American were hyphenated, but then some folks started speaking disparagingly of hyphenated identities and hyphenated Americans, and so the style now is not to use hyphens. But whether you use the literal hyphen or not, they get to a reality that our identities are often complex. You don't know who some of us are without knowing what that hyphenated identity is. It's a window into our past. Now, we were talking about this in session meeting yesterday, and our sister Dolores said something I thought was really profound. We were talking about people's identities going back in time, and she said, well, for some of us, our history, our ancestry has been stolen from us. We don't know what it is. And a light bulb went into my head that maybe everybody else is thought of but me. But because in the popular culture, you'll hear people saying, well, why don't we call a recent immigrant from Ghana an African American? Because they're from Africa and they're American. But part of that language of African American, the reason it's a whole continent, is because people have been cut off from their ancestry and are not always sure where their ancestors lived before they were forcibly transported, before they were captured and sold like cattle. But whether we use hyphens or not, all of us live at some level or another with multiple identities. And as Christians, we negotiate these multiple identities as we try to follow in the way, as we try to follow Jesus. It's not whether we have complex identities, we all do, some more than others, but how we negotiate those complex identities. Now, hyphenated identity points to some sort of dual identity. We're under pressure, sometimes internally and sometimes externally, to favor one side of that identity. And then sometimes for simplicity's sake or for all kinds of reasons, they'll say, well, why can't we just be Americans? Or why can't we just be Christians? But the fact is that the hyphens point to complex identities that we carry around with us, whether we acknowledge them or not. One of the days that was clearest to me was when I preached here in the summer. Someone's going to tell me the date, a couple of years ago, and I stood up and I looked back there in that corner over there and I went, why is everybody wearing green and gold today? And then I learned it was Jamaican Independence Day. So there was green and gold all over the place. Whether you become a U.S. citizen and you're proud to be an American, there's a part of you that's still that's still connected to that island and the history of that place. There we go. Well, in Acts 22, we learn about the different identities of the Apostle Paul and how he negotiates those identities as he follows in the way. His identity has at least three dimensions. He's a Jew, and he continues to be one. He's a follower of Christ, and he is a Roman. And those different identities play a part. So he begins by speaking to this group that has mischaracterized him and so he speaks as a Jew in Aramaic. Was sort of the contemporary dialect of Hebrew that was being spoken at the time. And he's been in all kinds of Gentile places, but he says, I am a Jew born in Tarsus, and then gives his bona fides, right? He's trained by Gamaliel, the great rabbi. He's trained as a strict interpreter of the law. I am passionately loyal to God. But the fear in the crowd leads to violence. Seems almost inevitable sometimes. But Paul talks about the place of violence in his own life, right? I harass those who followed this way to their death, arrest and delivering both men and women into prison. The high priest and the whole Jerusalem council can testify about me. I received letters from them addressed to our associates in Damascus, then went there to bring those who were arrested so they could be punished. The first part of his identity, at least as he understood it then. And then he recounts this encounter on the road to Damascus, where his religious zeal combined with the revelation that he received, took him away from violence and toward life. These people know I used to go from one synagogue to the next, beating those who believe in you and throwing them into prison. When Stephen, your witness, was being killed, I stood there giving my approval, even watching the clothes that belonged to those who were killing him. It's interesting to me that in this very arresting story on the road to Damascus, everyone sees the light, but only Saul hears the voice. Now, I have two thoughts about that. One is, if Saul came to me and said, everyone saw this light, but only I heard the voice, I'm not sure I'd be the first person to believe him. I'm just skeptical that way. But the other thing, there's something about this notion of hearing the voice in your ear that's very intimate. I don't know how many of y'all listen to podcasts on earbuds or headphones or something like that, but one of the things they talk about podcasts is that it's the most intimate way to kind of listen to or read, to consume information or whatever, because it's just you and them. It's just in your ear. And that's the way it was for Paul. And so he starts on his journey to become a follower of Jesus on the way. So Ananias was also of the people of God and one who had embraced Jesus. And so Paul tells this story of going to Ananias and to share that embrace, that intimate embrace with the Gentiles. But that was a bridge too far for the crowd. Every time I read this, I'm taken aback. He says, and then I was sent to the Gentiles, and it says, away with this man, he's not fit to live. Doesn't that seem like an extreme reaction? He's speaking of a future that's impossible for many to imagine. And this will not be the last time that the people of God turn to violence when they hear that God loves people they didn't think God loved. We kind of like our walls and our doors sometimes, and we don't want necessarily that door to open. Not only that, sometimes we actually want to hold on to it. It's not even that we can't imagine it, it's that we don't want to imagine it. Sometimes we hold hate closer to our hearts than we hold love. Often the people of God turn into a vicious mob because people they look down on, people they despise, are somehow accepted within the community. It's been a big theme in Acts. Unclean people, unclean food, becoming clean people and clean food, and not knowing some finding that good news and some finding that threatening news. The Romans are a little confused by all this. Now, one reason they may be confused is because they don't speak Aramaic. And so this whole dispute's been in a foreign language, but they can see there's a mob trying to get at somebody. So they do what all really good law keepers do. They decide torture is the way to figure this out. So they don't understand what the dispute has to do with the empire. Must be something else. And so Paul, as it says, they're strapping him down. And he makes the only move he can make, and he yells out, "I am a Roman citizen." Now, Paul it talks about being a Roman citizen 3 times in the book of Acts. In Acts 16, when he's about to get beaten. In Acts 22, when he's about to get beaten. And in Acts 25, when he appeals to be tried in a Roman court. He doesn't walk around going, "I'm a Roman citizen." What he does is he appeals to this when it's the only move he can make. He uses it in desperation. He tries to use his citizenship as a shield, as a protection. When you're in trouble, you'll use what you can. And Paul did. But it's not the central part of his identity. The central part of his identity is, I am a Jew and I am a follower of Christ. That's who he is. But he's also a Roman, and he'll use it when he has to. Those of us who follow along the way of Jesus, and by extension the way of Paul, we bring our whole lives into that following, into that way. Nothing is left behind. Our complex identities, our hyphenated identities, particularly sometimes in reference to our national identity. Now, I think Acts 22 is actually a fairly interesting commentary on what Paul says in Philippians 3. Our citizenship is in heaven. Sometimes this is used. Now, let me back up and then I'll get to that. Disciples of Jesus, like Paul, we're desperate citizens because we know that lives are at stake in the operations of the state. We see this every day on the news. We know that lives are at stake when the state operates. Paul's life was at stake. We've seen other folks see that. Desperate citizenship doesn't take citizenship lightly, but presses that citizenship to perform good for the sake of Jesus Christ. Claiming heavenly citizenship is not a world-denying move, as if this world doesn't matter, our homes are in heaven, that's the only thing that matters. It's a world-affirming move. Because if you look in Philippians 3, when Paul talks about this, what he's saying here isn't that we live there, not here. What he's saying is our citizenship in heaven means that we live by the rules of heaven. We live in a different way. And because we live in that different way, according to the kingdom, we are free to love unreservedly because our fate is not tied to our popularity, our prestige, our reputation, or even the length of our life. Paul invokes his Roman citizenship, his desperate citizenship, to fulfill his mission to the Gentiles, not just to save his own skin. He has said, the passage we looked at 2 weeks ago, that he's pouring out his life for the sake of the mission, and he doesn't know how long he'll live. Remember, when we tied that to Martin Luther King Jr.'s I've Been to the Mountaintop. Longevity has its place. but it's not the ultimate, right? Citizenship in heaven allows one to be faithful on this calling, regardless of the circumstances that may come up. We take our earthly and even our national citizenship seriously, not because of it's the most important thing, but insofar as it can feed our desire to perform good for the sake of Christ. The danger to the church and to each of us personally is when we take the parts of our identity that are not tied to following the way of Jesus and let those determine the shape of our lives and keep us from being faithful, where we hang on to things that keep us from going forward. Being a desperate citizenship takes courage. We talked a few weeks ago about how we're called to be courageous in the moment in which we now live. Because it's safer and easier to go with the flow, to be part of the crowd. Paul's life, and particularly in this passage in Acts 22, is an example of someone who takes his complex identity and orders them in such a way that he can be faithful to the one who has called him, the one who spoke in his ear, the one who called him on that way and turned him from a path of death and violence to a path of light and love. All of us are called continually to choose this day whom we shall serve. I am not confident that every decision I make is the one that will keep me on the path. Maybe you are. I'm not. Sometimes I just don't know what to do. But I am confident that if we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, if we together encourage one another and shape one another to follow on that way, if we help each other to develop the courage to live out our citizenship in heaven, not in a way that's irrelevant to the world, but a way that feeds ministry to the world, that the long arc of our lives will be faithful. The long arc of our lives will take us where we need to go.